Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. When Toan stands at a turning point that could change his entire life, so he no longer has to watch Tu Diem struggle alone in the fields every day. While Tu Diem quietly carries all the pressure without saying a word, will his decision be enough to change their future? Now let's explore the story of Toan and Tu Diem. Can they get through this difficult time and hold on to their quiet moments together? If you enjoy this, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next videos. The early sunlight slipped through the wooden slats and stretched into long, thin lines across the simple wooden table where Toan and Tu Diem sat facing each other. The house was quiet, holding a steady stillness that only broke with the soft, repetitive sound of spoons touching the sides of their bowls. Steam rose slowly from the hot porridge, carrying the familiar scent of rice that filled the small space with a sense of warmth, but also something very real and grounded. Nothing in that moment felt rushed. Everything moved at a slow, natural pace. Tu Diem placed her spoon down first. She stood up gently, her movement calm and controlled, and said she would head out to harvest. Her voice stayed even, just like every other morning, but Toan's expression shifted slightly. His eyes revealed a concern that had been building quietly for days. He reached forward and took her hand, holding it longer than usual, as if trying to keep her there just a little more. He spoke slowly and directly. He did not circle around his thoughts. The farm work was stable. It brought in enough to get by. But he did not want to continue living in a way that felt fixed and limiting. He wanted a different path. He wanted work that allowed him to control his time, so he could be at home more often, so he could stand beside her instead of watching her carry everything alone out in the fields day after day. His tone stayed steady, but the meaning behind his words was clear. Tu Diem listened without interrupting. Then she gave a small, gentle smile and shook her head. She answered in a simple way. She told him he did not need to worry about her that much. She was used to this life. She was used to walking long distances. She was used to the heat, the wind, and the quiet work that filled her days. She told him to focus on his own responsibilities and not let his attention drift away. A brief silence settled between them. No one spoke right away. The small sounds in the room became clearer. Toan looked directly into her eyes. This time, he did not hold anything back. He said he would not let the past control his decisions anymore. He would not keep living under the weight of what had already happened. He would focus on what was in front of him now, and he would stay by her side for the long term, without hesitation, without stepping away again. His voice remained low, but every word carried weight. Tu Diem nodded slowly. Her eyes grew slightly red, but she did not say anything more. Her fingers tightened around his hand, answering him without words. In that small house, the moment was quiet, but it was enough. They both understood exactly what the other meant. She sat back down and continued eating. Toan stayed where he was, watching her. He told her to eat a little more. He noticed how much thinner she had become compared to before. His concern showed, but he kept it controlled, not wanting to turn it into something heavy. Tu Diem gave a small laugh, soft and brief. The tension eased slightly. Both of them understood their situation clearly. Life was not gentle. It demanded effort every single day. But they also understood something very simple and practical. As long as they stayed together, they could keep going. After finishing, Tu Diem stood up again. She adjusted her scarf, checked her tools, and prepared to leave. Toan did not stop her this time. He only watched. There was hope in his eyes, but also a growing pressure that he could not ignore. He knew that change was no longer something he could delay. It was necessary. The door opened and the light from outside poured in. Tu Diem stepped out and followed the familiar red dirt path that led toward the fields behind the house. The morning air felt cooler outside. It carried the scent of damp soil mixed with fresh leaves. Tu Diem moved quickly once she reached the rows of cabbages. She bent down and began working without hesitation. Her hands moved in a steady rhythm, cutting each cabbage cleanly and stacking them in neat groups. She did not waste movement. Each action followed the next with efficiency that came from repetition. Sweat began to form on her forehead and slowly ran down the side of her face, but she did not stop. When she looked at the cabbages she had harvested, she could clearly see the result of her effort. The heads were firm, tightly wrapped, and ready to sell. She remembered what Toan had explained before. Selling directly to a stall meant accepting a price about 10 to 15% lower than the market, but it could save 2 to 3 hours of waiting. Over a full day, that time made a real difference. She gathered the cabbages and started walking toward the roadside stall. Along the way, she slowed down for a moment. Near the edge of the path, small wildflowers grew in scattered clusters. No one took care of them, yet they continued to grow steadily. She looked at them more carefully. A simple thought came to her. Bringing a few of them back and planting them near the house could change how the space felt. Even a small change could make daily life feel lighter. At the stall, the woman weighed each cabbage one by one. The price offered was 8,000 jong per head. It was lower than the usual 9 to 10,000 at the open market, but the process was quick. No waiting, no standing under the sun for hours. Tu Diem calculated quickly. If she sold 20 cabbages, she would lose around 20 to 40,000 jong compared to the market price. But she would gain back hours of time and save her energy. She made the decision immediately and agreed without negotiating further. She kept one cabbage aside. She had already decided how to use it. That night, she would prepare cabbage rolls for Toan, the same way Thu's mother used to make them. The thought stayed with her as she finished the sale and turned back toward the house. Her steps slowed as she walked across the wide field. The work she did every day had become routine, something her body followed automatically. But that day, the meaning behind it felt clearer. Every step, every effort, every moment of tiredness had a purpose. Someone was waiting for her at home. That was enough reason to continue. Back at the house, Toan sat alone. The sunlight from the window fell across his face, making his expression more defined. His phone rested on the table in front of him. He picked it up and called Alex. His voice was direct and steady. He asked about his previous job. The answer came quickly. The position had already been filled. There was nothing left for him there. He ended the call and moved on without hesitation. He called Hi next. This time, the tone on the other side carried a different kind of possibility. There were no openings in construction, but there was another path. Timber, harvesting, processing, exporting. Hi explained the structure clearly. The business worked through 3 main parts: sourcing raw materials, processing them into usable products, and exporting them to buyers overseas. Toan listened carefully, focusing on each detail. He had no experience in this field, but he understood something important right away. This type of work allowed more control over time. It did not lock him into long, continuous projects like construction did. He began comparing the two in his mind. Construction projects often lasted from 6 to 18 months. They required constant supervision and carried heavy pressure to meet deadlines. Timber work, on the other hand, could be divided into smaller orders. Each cycle could be shorter. That meant more flexibility. Memories of his past work came back clearly. The constant competition, the pressure that never stopped. The nights spent away from home, these were not things he could not handle, but they were things he no longer wanted to return to. He took a slow breath and looked around the house again. This was the place Tu Diem worked hard for every day. The pressure he felt now was clear and direct. He needed to change. This was not a temporary thought. It was a necessary step if he wanted their situation to improve. The call ended. He stayed still for a moment, holding the phone tightly in his hand. The wind moved through the roof, creating a soft, steady sound. It repeated again and again, like a reminder that time continued moving forward. Toan stood up. The decision was not completely settled, but it was enough to take action. He would meet Ly in person and learn more. The roadside cafe was quiet, with only a few people sitting at separate tables. The distant sound of motorbikes blended with the light clinking of glasses. Toan sat across from Ly. Ly began explaining about Toan, a man who was looking for a partner in the timber business. The details were clear. There were existing orders from overseas buyers. Demand was stable, but capital was needed to maintain operations, and trust was essential for partnership. Toan spoke honestly. He admitted he had no direct experience in timber, but he had managed a large construction company before. He understood operations, planning, and managing people. He believed he could learn what he did not yet know. Ly nodded in agreement. The timber sector was growing strongly in Vietnam. Raw materials were available in multiple regions. Export demand continued to rise each year. Toan listened carefully, absorbing each point. Hope began to take a clearer shape, but he still held on to caution. His thoughts returned again to Tu Diem, working in the field. He did not want her to carry more pressure. He wanted to change that. The conversation continued for some time. Ly eventually gave him Tan's phone number and told him he could reach out directly to discuss details. Toan wrote the number down. His hand moved slightly, a small shake that came not from fear, but from understanding the weight of the moment. This could be a turning point. Ly received a call related to work and had to leave. Toan stayed seated alone for a while, watching people pass by. The pressure had not disappeared, but it had become clearer. There was now a possible direction. He stood up slowly. Inside him, something had shifted. It was not certainty, but it was enough. A decision was beginning to form, steady and real. Toan stepped out of the cafe, the afternoon sunlight falling directly across his shoulders. The warmth was steady, not harsh, but clear enough to make everything around him feel more defined. He paused for a few seconds near the entrance, looking at the road where motorbikes passed in a constant flow. His thoughts were no longer scattered like before. They had started to settle into a direction. It was not fully certain yet, but it was enough for him to move forward. He walked slowly along the roadside, his attention drawn to a small household shop. Inside, a tea set placed neatly on a shelf caught his eye. The design was simple, light in color, with a smooth and solid surface. He stepped inside and picked it up, checking each piece carefully. It was not expensive, but it felt suitable for their home. He imagined quiet evenings, sitting together without rushing, just drinking water and talking. That image stayed with him for a moment. Then he chose the largest set available in the shop. After paying, he held the box carefully, keeping it steady in his hands as he walked back. His steps felt lighter than in the morning. Not because everything had been solved, but because he had begun to see a way forward. When he arrived home, Tu Diem was already there. She had just finished trimming the old flower stems and had gathered them neatly to one side of the yard. When she saw him, she looked up, and her eyes brightened immediately. Toan placed the box on the table and opened it. Both of them looked at the new tea set. Tu Diem reached out and touched the surface, checking its thickness and firmness. She nodded and said it looked good and would be very practical to use. Toan did not say much. He only smiled. The feeling inside him was simple. It was a clear sense of ease. They carried the set to wash it. Water flowed steadily, and the sound of water touching the cups created a familiar rhythm. They stood side by side, each doing a part of the work. Tu Diem talked about selling the cabbages earlier in the day. She mentioned the number she sold, the price she accepted, and the reason she chose speed over waiting for a higher price. Toan listened without interrupting, nodding from time to time. He wiped each cup carefully and placed them on the table in order. His movements were slow and steady, not rushed. Small actions, but clear and intentional. They did not need to say much. Both of them understood that these moments mattered. Not because they were special events, but because they were stable and real. The late afternoon sunlight came through the window and spread a soft golden light across the room. The space felt warmer. During that time, the pressure of everything outside seemed to fade for a while. Toan looked at Tu Diem. He did not say it out loud, but the thought was clear in his mind. He would do whatever he could to keep moments like this. They began preparing dinner. The stove was lit, and the flame burned steadily. Toan stood beside her, cutting herbs and preparing the ingredients. Tu Diem worked with the cabbage, separating each leaf and dipping them into hot water to soften them. Their movements were familiar. They had done this many times before. While working, Tu Diem mentioned how Thu's mother used to roll the cabbage. She explained each step clearly, from placing the filling to wrapping it tightly and arranging it in the pot. Toan listened and followed carefully. From time to time, their eyes met. They exchanged short words, enough to keep everything moving smoothly. They talked about their day. Tu Diem described her work in the field, the harvest, and her decision to sell quickly to save time. Toan shared about his call with Ly and the possible direction in the timber business. He did not go into too much detail, but enough for her to understand the situation. Tu Diem listened, and then said something simple. She would support whatever decision he made, as long as it felt right for him and could be sustained over time. There were no conditions, no added pressure, just a clear agreement. Toan paused for a few seconds and looked at her. He understood everything she had been through. The long hours in the field, the physical effort, the quiet endurance. Yet she stood there, steady and unchanged. That made his decision feel even more solid. The smell of food began to fill the house. The flame lowered slightly. They continued rolling each cabbage leaf and placing them neatly in the pot. The repeated actions did not feel tiring. Instead, they created a sense of order. When everything was ready, they looked at the meal in front of them. It was not complicated, but it was complete. It was the result of a full day of work, combining effort and coordination. A light breeze moved through the doorway, carrying the faint scent of flowers from the yard. The space stayed quiet. Nothing unusual happened, but the connection between them was clear. At that moment, the sound of a motorbike stopped at the gate. Thu walked in, carrying a brand new wooden table and chair set. Toan and Tu Diem looked up in surprise and quickly stepped outside to meet him. Thu placed the set down in the yard. The wood was new, carefully finished, with an even color across the surface. He explained simply that it was a gift made by a craftsman so they could have a more comfortable place to eat. He did not speak for long, just enough to explain. Toan and Tu Diem looked at the set, then at Thu. Their reaction was not loud, but it was clear. They thanked him. The three of them sat down right there to try it. The atmosphere became more relaxed. Toan asked Thu about the timber business. The question was direct. Thu answered clearly. The field had potential, especially in exports. If done correctly, it could create stable income. He added that he still had connections in the industry and was willing to help if needed, even with capital. Toan listened carefully. This information gave more weight to his decision. It was no longer just an idea. It had a clearer foundation. Tu Diem sat beside them and poured water into the new tea set. She handed each cup to them. Her eyes showed clear gratitude, not only toward Thu, but toward everyone who had supported them. Thu received a call and had to leave soon after. Before leaving, he said he would come back another day to share a meal. Even after he left, the warmth remained. Toan and Tu Diem looked at each other. There was no need for many words. They both understood their situation. There were still difficulties, but there was also support. There was pressure, but there was also direction. Toan pulled Tu Diem closer and said one thing clearly. They would live better and more steadily, so they wouldn't disappoint the people who had trusted and helped them. They returned to the kitchen and continued finishing the meal. Their voices stayed soft, mixed with small moments of laughter. Nothing complicated, but enough to keep the atmosphere light. The new table and chair set stood quietly in the yard, like a clear sign of what was coming next. Not an immediate change, but the beginning of a process. The evening breeze moved through again, carrying the familiar scent of the fields. Nothing was fully certain yet, but one thing remained clear. As long as they stayed together, they could keep going.
Buổi sáng yên tĩnh bắt đầu với bữa ăn đơn giản nhưng chứa nhiều suy nghĩ khi Toàn bày tỏ mong muốn thay đổi công việc để có nhiều thời gian bên Từ Diễm hơn. Dù quen với cuộc sống vất vả, Từ Diễm vẫn âm thầm làm việc ngoài đồng và chọn cách bán nhanh để tiết kiệm thời gian. Trong khi đó, Toàn đối mặt với việc mất cơ hội quay lại công việc cũ và bắt đầu cân nhắc hướng đi mới trong ngành gỗ. Cuộc gặp với Hải và những thông tin từ Tư giúp anh dần có niềm tin vào lựa chọn này. Buổi tối, họ cùng nhau chuẩn bị bữa ăn, chia sẻ và ủng hộ lẫn nhau. Những hành động nhỏ, sự giúp đỡ từ mọi người xung quanh và quyết tâm thay đổi tạo nên hy vọng cho một cuộc sống ổn định hơn.